U.S. ambassadors represent the United States around the world and help maintain diplomatic relationships with other nations and organizations. Some ambassadors are career diplomats. They spent their lives working in foreign affairs, gaining deep expertise on a certain region, learning the language, and becoming an expert in the field. But that's not necessarily a prerequisite for the job. So then how do U.S. ambassadors get appointed? And why does it seem like these appointments have become so political? First, some basics. The president can nominate ambassadors and the Senate confirms them. But beyond that, there aren't a whole lot of rules or requirements for who can or can't be an ambassador. And over the last 40 years, the amount of ambassadors with no diplomatic experience have increased, along with the amount of money they've contributed to the campaigns of the presidents who appointed them. I want to talk to someone who has studied this, so I'm going to call Ryan Scoville. He has spent a lot of time looking at documents and data around U.S. ambassador appointments.
So the political appointees are not only more common, but they are contributing more money, and their credentials are weaker. The average campaign contribution from career appointees, individuals who come from the Foreign Service, over the last 40 years is $33. In contrast, the average campaign contribution from political appointees is over $85,000. If we were to compare political appointees under the Reagan administration, for example, to political appointees under Trump, there's been a nearly 1,400% increase in the average campaign contributions by political appointees. Yeah, and that's after adjusting for inflation.
Some say the way ambassadorships are set up enable politicians to use them as rewards for powerful connections. Former co-owner of the Texas Rangers and St. Louis Cardinals, Mercer Reynolds, was nominated as ambassador to Switzerland under George W. Bush. And Shirley Temple Black, yep, that iconic American Child star, was an ambassador to Ghana under President Gerald Ford, an ambassador to Czechoslovakia under President George H.W. Bush. And while those appointments may seem unexpected but relatively harmless, there are other appointments that have warranted much harsher criticism. For example, Obama was one of several presidents criticized for appointing supporters of his campaign with little diplomatic experience. Like Louis Sussman, his ambassador to the UK. The investment banker had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for Obama's 2008 campaign. Ambassadors with political connections are also usually sent to more stable, well-developed countries, whereas career diplomats tend to be sent to less developed areas. And the Trump administration is no exception to this trend. Robert Woody Johnson IV is co-owner of the New York Jets and grandson of the co-founder of Johnson & Johnson. He's a GOP donor and endorsed Trump for president in 2016. He's the ambassador to the UK.
The political appointees have become weaker in the sense that they're less likely to have language abilities, less likely to have experience in the receiving state, less likely to have experience in foreign policy, in organizational leadership as well.
In fact, right now, 64 of the 188 U.S. ambassador positions are held by political appointees, not career diplomats. And 29 positions aren't filled at all, including ambassadorships to countries like Syria and Venezuela.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways the trends predate Trump, but they have become particularly acute during the Trump administration.
This practice has come into focus as the ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, has become a key figure in the Ukraine controversy. He is not a career diplomat, but a businessman who was a major donor to the Trump campaign, leaving many wondering why the U.S. seems to have this practice of awarding ambassadorships as political favors. Still, others argue that having a direct line to the president and a non-political perspective could actually help international diplomacy. Why is this something that the American public should maybe be concerned about?
People who have weaker credentials and who are entering into office, largely, it seems, due to the influence of their financial contributions, are quite likely to perform in a way that is inferior in comparison to those who have, decades of experience and background in foreign policy and a long time of service in the Foreign Service itself. So it's primarily an issue insofar as credentials foreshadow and predict performance.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.